Hi, this is Benjamin Kerstein. I'm a film critic for The New Ledger, Federalist, several other publications, and this is my critic's commentary to Sam Peckinpah's extraordinary and, I think it's safe to say, extremely disturbing film, Straw Dogs. I'm doing this, I guess you could say, out of my own self-indulgence. And I've done a couple of these commentaries before that I've gotten a pretty good reaction. And it's been a while since I've done one, so I thought I'd come back with one that's, easy to do. Which, if I'd really wanted to do that, I probably wouldn't have picked a film like this. What I'm going to do is to give you a countdown in case you want to watch the film along with this commentary. Obviously, for copyright reasons, I can't put the film up itself. And It's going to start right when the opening shot in the graveyard fades in. So if you want to line it up there, I'm going to count down from five. Five, four, three, two, one. Now. Um, it's hard to know exactly where to start with a picture like this. I think in some ways these opening shots sort of tell you more or less everything you need to know. They're unfocused. The titles are black on white. And ultimately, they sort of descend into abstract shapes. And I think particularly this shot here of what transpires in the end to be a shot of children playing, looks at first as if it's just sort of insects moving around or worms moving around. Recalling an image, very famous image from the Wild Bunch, where the children are burning they're putting red ants onto a scorpion, and they're killing the scorpion, and then the children burn it. And I think this here, with these kind of insect or worm-like shapes, very slowly, Jerry Fielding, whose score here is absolutely magnificent, um, whose shapes then sort of slowly form into this picture of innocents dancing in a graveyard, sort of tells you everything about what this film is going to be doing, which is to take a very strange, dissonant, at times almost surreal, and certainly utterly unsparing view of human nature. And of course, children, in their apparent innocence, being the least likely let's say the least likely to engage in the kind of horrific violence that we're going to see in this picture, is very much Peckinpah, I think, making a statement that this is something ingrained in us. Here is the first of the film's controversial images of starting on Susan George's breasts, showing that she's not wearing a bra. Anyway, I think that what Peckinpah is trying to say in this film is really, in some ways, summed up in those two shots. I think right off the bat, it's important to say, and you saw it there in that shot of Susan George. This is a film that has been accused of misogyny from the moment that it was released, and as a result, it has been, and I think in some ways, simply buried. You don't hear very much about this film. People don't usually tend to talk about it, and when they do talk about it, it's very uncomfortably, and everyone sort of says, yeah, it's a very powerful movie, but it's blah 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 blah. It's this and this and this, and then they sort of end the conversation. There's no defense against the charge of misogyny in this picture. It is a misogynistic film. It is a sexist film. There's no doubt about that. Contemporary interviews with Peckinpah about the film absolutely confirm this. The way he talks about Susan George's character, Amy, is very derogatory. He says in one interview that she's not a wife, she's a pussy. And that, I think one has to be honest and accept that fact about this movie. I don't think that the misogyny in the picture is the complete. Uh, uh, Sorry to repeat myself. I don't think that the misogyny is the complete picture of the film. I think that this movie is. I hate to use it because it's a word that's been almost generated by the men's rights movement and the alt right, I suppose you could say, online. But the term misandrist, which is a hatred of men or a very negative view of men, this film, I think, is also, if we have to use the word, a misandrist picture. Its view of men is extremely dark, and uh, in a lot of ways, as misogynistic as it is, Susan George's character is the most human character in the whole film. She's the most fully drawn, and she's the only one who really reacts with any sanity and understanding of what in the end ends up happening in this picture. There's another issue that feminists raised, which is the local child molester there playing ball with the with the young girl that later on in the film appears to be inviting her own murder. Um, I think it also needs to be said that one of the things that may, if this film is redeemed from its misogyny, it is redeemed by Susan George, who gives an absolutely magnificent performance in this picture, and I think humanizes Amy in a way that Peckinpah may not have intended and may not have been able to. Here's David Warner, the wonderful David Warner, as the local child molester. A terrific British actor who I think never got the recognition that he deserved, but he was in a couple of very good 70s movies, and he was in Peckinpah's previous film, which was The Ballad of Cable Hogue, in which he gives an absolutely magnificent performance as the jack-legged preacher, who ends up giving that beautiful eulogy for Cable Hogue in that extraordinary final scene, that beautifully theatrical final scene. Yeah, there's the first real instance of violence. And the way that this film depicts men is I think, if anything, far more brutal and far more critical than in the way it depicts women. The men in this film are essentially battling throughout for dominance. It's the alpha males versus the beta males. And the trick that Peckinpah pulls is that throughout the picture, Dustin Hoffman's character, David, appears to be the beta male, and these guys appear to be the alpha males. And they are constantly working to push him down into his place and there we go. You can see how quickly this breaks out. Alcohol also being a huge issue in this picture. The fact that drinking is part of what leads to this. Very, very honest, I think, view of male violence. Alcohol or drugs are very, very often involved in really horrific acts of male violence. And there's David slinking off into the corner. He is a coward. He's a coward for most of the film. And I think that because of that cowardice, as it is for most people who aren't particularly physically courageous, when they get bullied, what builds up in them is tremendous rage and that instinctual desire to be the dominating male, the alpha male. And at the end of this picture, this very long, slow burn that Peckinpah so brilliantly sustains throughout the first 3/4 of this movie, that's what's going to explode at the end of this, is that rage that slowly builds up within him. Because he's as much a part of this, this sort of male pantomime, this male competition for power, as these guys. He likes to think that he can stand aside from it, but he's got the same instincts they do, the same desire to dominate that they do. And he, in the end, unleashes that. It comes out of him. And he defends his territory. And he becomes, if you like, an animalistic. The animal side of him, the instinctual side of him comes out. And what I think Peckinpah is trying to say in the end is that this is how men are. This is a fact of life. And there's no point in lying to ourselves about it. And David, throughout the picture, is lying to himself and saying that he's not a violent person. He's not a barbaric or whatever in the way these guys are. See, here he's making a point there. She's making a point, excuse me. Um, she's actually a much more dominating figure than he is at the beginning of the film, which is one of the reasons why I think the guys end up raping her quite brutally in a scene that I'll talk about when it comes, but is easily the most controversial, one of the most controversial scenes, I would say, in film history. Um, it should be noted, though, that Peckinpah did not think that he was making, if you like, a Hobbesian film. He didn't think that the violence he was depicting was a result of life being nasty, brutish, and short, and that men are inherently savage, and that savageness comes out in this sort of state of nature. Peckinpah actually took the opposite view. He felt that violence was a product of society. He took, if you like, a Rousseauian or even a sort of quasi-Marxist view. And that it's actually, yeah, see, he even runs away from her sexual aggression, you know. And, you get the sense that people felt that this was also stereotypical, that she's a sex pot and he's unable to satisfy her. I actually don't think that's true. I think that this guy looks so much like Robert De Niro in the 70s. It absolutely freaks me out. That the two of them, I think it's just that he's a withdrawn figure and he's hiding. And she's making another point here, I would say. And of course, she has a past with this town and with these guys. And she's moved up in the world, if you like, and they haven't. And she lets them know it. And for that, they are going to horrifically, again, try to, by violating her, force her into a submissive position, which I think is, quite frankly, extremely honest. I think that's what, one of the great reasons, I think, for rape is for male dominance of women by violence. And that's absolutely what's depicted in this film. There's no question about it. And it's depicted very unsparingly. Although I do think that the rape scene is quite problematic for other reasons that I'll get into. But that part of it is absolutely straightforward. Men do this kind of thing all the time. Anyway, getting back to what Peckinpah believed ultimately was the source of violence. Peckinpah believed that human society was the source of violence, and that the battle for dominance in human society is what causes violence. If you look at his films, particularly the Westerns, when you have solitary men who are by themselves or maybe with one friend or two, very, very often, actually, it's quite peaceful. There isn't violence in the wilderness. There isn't violence in any sort of savage state. It's actually when they come into contact with civilization that the forces begin to build up and end up resulting in many of Peckinpah's films a kind of apocalyptic carnage. And I think if you view this film in the context of The Wild Bunch, and I will be heretical and say that I think this is a better film than The Wild Bunch, in some ways a much better film than The Wild Bunch, you see that, and here we have this sort of, he has this one line that's so disturbing where he says, "I want what's in him." Again, this, in this way too, they're sexually dominating her in a way by stealing her underwear, in The Wild Bunch, you have the big apocalypse. You have that obviously extraordinary sequence at the end where they fight off the whole Mexican army. And in this film, you have a smaller apocalypse. He's wearing a German army cross there on his shirt, which I do not think is coincidental. Yeah, right there. So I think with Straw Dogs, it's depicted in microcosm. It's David's presence in this community to which he doesn't belong and in which he is viewed as, again, a kind of beta male, that leads to this slow building up of struggle over dominance, which then ends in a kind of small mini apocalypse where everything is destroyed. And as, of course, the famous last line of this picture says, David Warner says, "I don't know my way home," and David says, "I don't either." Well, the reason he doesn't know is because it's all been destroyed. The whole thing has just descended into carnage and destruction, and now he's left in the sort of the ruins of it and has to find some way to go on in that incredibly bleak and quite extraordinary ending. Here's where Amy starts to get bratty. I think this is another aspect of her performance that, of her character that feminists didn't like, is that she seems childlike, and that she's not like a mature woman, and she doesn't act with, she's depicted as being a kind of this juvenile sex bot. I don't think that's really true. I think that it's actually rather sympathetic. She's just trying to get his attention. He's not responding to her really, and I think he says at another point, I'm not exactly sure where, he says, "I love you, Amy, but I want you to leave me alone." Well, that's, you can't really love someone and want them to leave you alone all the time. He's not really paying any attention to her. He doesn't really value her. He may view her as a juvenile sex bot. But I think it's unfair to say that she's entirely depicted that way. I think that she's mainly because of Susan George's performance. I think she's by far the most sympathetic character in the whole film. That may be in spite of Peckinpah and not because of him. Susan George may have been able to bring something to it that Peckinpah himself did not intend. People like to think of auteurist directors as being kind of omnipotent, that everything in the film is a result of the director. That's, I don't think, here's David. He's afraid of them. And as a result, again, this is the issue of sexual dominance. That's his woman. He doesn't want to think that he thinks like that, but he does. She's a possession of sorts to him. And the other guys, by possessing her, feel that they're harming him. The rape scene in this film is all about the men. To be fully honest, I hope that doesn't offend some people when I say it, but the rape scene is all about their dominance over David. It's not really about her. I mean, obviously, it is to an extent about her in that they want to humiliate and dominate her, but it's ultimately to get to David that they do it. And to feel themselves superior to him. Anyway, as I was saying, we like to think of the auteurist director as being responsible for everything. I think Susan George and Dustin Hoffman here contribute as much to the film as Peckinpah ever did. I think particularly Susan George. She manages to humanize Amy and to make her into a much more fully rounded character than I think Peckinpah's script Peckinpah and David Zella Goodman, who wrote the screenplay, I think that they didn't necessarily provide her with everything that she comes through with here. And in a lot of ways, I would say the problematic aspects of her character are maybe, if you like, vestiges of what they wrote and what Peckinpah sort of wanted. I think Susan George, in a way, may have subverted what Peckinpah wanted by giving a much more human and vulnerable and intelligent performance, I think, than they may have expected. I think, and David obviously acts this way too. He sees himself as the smart one. He's the mathematical genius, She's the sort of silly little girl. She's not stupid at all. She's not obviously anywhere near as well educated as he is. Yeah, what he says here, that's how you talk about a child, really. He infantilizes her. Excuse me. And, the way this guy has no expression. It's just, it's a remarkable thing about this movie, how Peckinpah sort of builds very slowly and sort of, you see like these little incidents slowly building to bigger incidents, slowly building to even bigger incidents until it all comes apart at the end in this kind of cathartic eruption. Um, it's also worth talking about Dustin Hoffman in terms of I'm probably in a minority, a very small minority here. I think this is by far and away Dustin Hoffman's best performance. I don't actually really care for Dustin Hoffman as an actor. I have to admit, I find him very mannered and stylized in a kind of irritating way. To be fully honest, he always just strikes me as playing the kind of nebbish in a way that sort of Woody Allen does. And no matter what he plays, he's playing the nebbish. He sort of can't help it. But I think in this film, he is absolutely extraordinary. And what the way that he plays both the nebbish, if you like, in the beginning, and then at the end of the picture, when David finally cracks, finally loses it. And I think that he went farther than he ever went again in his career. Maybe never wanted to go as far as that in his career. And I think it's really something to behold. He's really quite extraordinary in this film. And it's interesting that the constable he's the only force of law and order. And in some ways, this fellow here in the cap, the bartender, is the only, not the bartender, sorry. Niles's brother. He's the only decent person in the town in some ways, along with the constable. Yeah, you can see here, even here, every scene in this movie is competition between the men. Every scene in this picture almost every scene displays some sort of tension and competition between men over their dominance, over their status. Yeah, this is this is Peckinpah being extremely perverse, where you have the brother and sister appearing slightly incestuous, it has to be said, who are now going to be watching the engaging in some voyeurism. I think actually the charges of misogyny in some ways are far stronger as they relate to the girl that we just saw. She is kind of just like a childish sex pot and doesn't really have much more of an identity outside of that. And of course, in the end, she tempts the local child molester in a way that is both sort of unbelievable and kind of, yeah, here again, David engaging in some very small violence. It's in him too, Yeah. And she's trying to learn to play chess, probably to somehow. Dustin Hoffman is pretty funny there. Yeah. Yeah, this girl here, I think, she's something of a stereotype, if you like, and she is portrayed as being somewhat responsible for what, in the end, happens to her. I'm presuming stolen a bit from Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and that's I think the charges of misogyny there are quite justified. And there's the cat who's going to be horribly killed not long after. This is funny too because this is really twisted. I think Peckinpah really liked that stuff. He was a provocateur. He was a guy who loved to transgress. I actually showed this movie to a class once at Tel Aviv University. And one of the I'll talk about it a bit later, but one of the girls in the class, one of the women said, this is he was, this is obviously a misogynist picture, and this is justifies rape and all this sort of thing. And I said that's all that's a perfectly valid point of view, but it does need to be understood that what Peckinpah was after was to transgress. He wanted to go up to the edge of the cliff and then drive right off it at full speed. And you have to take, in some ways, what comes with that. Although I certainly don't think there's any problem with critiquing this picture. But I think one does have to be aware that Peckinpah's whole idea was to go too far. And I think that's true of almost all of his movies. There's always several parts in his movies where things go too far, and that's what he wanted. See, I think it's interesting here. I remember listening to a commentary by a film scholar, I think, on the DVD of this picture years ago when it was on the Criterion Collection, I think on the Criterion Collection. And he said that it's clear that their marriage is in trouble. And this scene really exemplifies that there's nothing really left for them except sex and this sort of thing. I don't think that's really true. I think they have a lot of... there is actually a great deal of affection for each other. And even though he's a distant person, I think he does care about her, and I think she cares about him. It's only at the end of the film when he's... this is like a very playful, very sort of intimate, gentle kind of scene, really, in some ways. And, they're laughing, and there's, but there's... I think it's only at the end of the film when he does go all the way around the bend and the violence in him comes out, that they sort of, that the gap between them becomes totally unbridgeable. In a way, I think there's a sense in this picture that she may have gone for him because he's so different. Yeah, this is really... when they're watching them have sex, it's so perverse. I think that, it's implied somewhat, I think, that she may have gone for him because he's different than the guys she grew up with. He's not like a macho man. He's not, this kind of aggressive. He's not these guys. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't steal her panties and, show them around and stuff like that, I think this is today what feminists would call rape culture, what's going on here, which is a pretty apt description, I suppose. Yeah, and here they've gone bad. Yeah. That guy's giggle is so creepy, especially in the final sequence. It really yeah, see here he's treating her quite badly. I don't see how this reflects badly on her. I don't see how it shows her as being infantile or just a sex pot or whatever. I think that it reflects really badly on him. He's acting in an extremely childish way. There it is. I love you, but I want you to leave me alone. That's, it's terribly hurtful. There's darkness in him right from the beginning. She's really sort of trying to reach out to him, and he's just doesn't respond. In a way, he dominates her in a way that he's not able to dominate the men. Which may cause him, I think, a feeling of inadequacy, which may then lead into him being even more dominating over her. And she's just trying to let him know, where the hell are you? Don't talk to me like that. Again, I think it really comes through with Susan George, her performance. I think she really makes it, with her eyes and the very hurt expression in her eyes and stuff. I do think she's much more sympathetic, I think, than most people give the film credit for. I'm not sure Peckinpah should get credit for that, but I think she should. Yeah, she's the prey, really. Sexual predators, I suppose, is what they'd be called today. I think it's interesting that if you look at, see, this is one of the things that people had a real problem with. seems to be tempting the men, that she seems to be inviting them to rape her. Um, this kind of stuff was really was very, very controversial then, and it's controversial now to the extent that the film is talked about at all. Um, it's not clear that she knows they're watching. Yeah, and then she goes in and complains about it. And any woman will tell you that things like that happen an awful lot. So something that men don't realize how often that happens. And what is David's reaction? Why don't you wear a bra? You should expect this kind of thing. He's not any better than they are, really. He's the same. He's as bad as they are. Again, pointing to, I hate to use the word, but the misandry of this picture. The men are throughout portrayed as pretty awful, including David, and the men who aren't pretty awful are totally impotent and ineffective. So it's not a very good. It doesn't make men look particularly good either. Which is something the feminists, I think, have never given this film credit for. But I can certainly understand a lot of their other criticisms. But like one does need to point out that Peckinpah is ecumenical in his criticisms of human beings. There's a case to be made that Peckinpah is a misanthropic filmmaker. Even his noble characters, and there's no noble characters in this picture, but even his noble characters in some of his other films tend to meet with extremely ignoble ends, whether it's, Pike Bishop and the Wild Bunch, or, the characters, I can't remember his name, but the main character who dies at the end of Ride the High Country, who's really a very noble guy, and yet meets a rather tragic end. They become ignoble in their deaths in a way, which is, although I suppose in Ride the High Country there is a note of redemption there, but it's a pretty misanthropic world, and he got more and more misanthropic as he went on in his career. And I think by the time you reach Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, it's just the main character in Alfredo Garcia is at the very, very end sort of tries to take a noble stand, and he does take his revenge, but then of course he's ripped to shreds by machine gun bullets afterwards. So it's not it's not much of a testimony for that. Again, see, you feel like they probably could have made it at another time and place. You feel like maybe if they'd stayed in the United States or whatever, it could have worked out. But this society that they've come into, in order to sort of deal with them, creates a pattern of escalating intimidation, and that ends in catastrophe. I never claimed to be one of the involved. Yeah, it should be remembered that this film was made at a time of great dissension over the Vietnam War and civil rights and student protests and all the rest of it. And this is another one that feminists really hated, and I think rightfully so. It's pretty bad. Yeah. Don't forget to draw the curtain. I suppose a scene like this can't be justified, but it's again Peckinpah just going too far. I think if he had gone for safety in this film, it wouldn't have the same power. It wouldn't have the same capacity to disturb the viewer, and I think that's why I've never seen the remake. But from what I've heard, the director removed all of these scenes that were offensive or that appeared to be appalling in the context of today's time, and I've never seen it, and I won't see it because Rod Lurie, who directed the film, is I think the worst director in America today. He's not only has he never made a good film, he's never made even a mediocre film. All of his films are terrible, and to see a film made by one of the greatest directors in history be remade by one of the worst directors in history is not something I'm interested in. But certainly that the film came and went without comment. is obviously due to the fact that the guy probably played it safe. The last thing Peckinpah was deliberately playing it unsafe here, and parts of it are offensive, and parts of it are reprehensible, and this film does deserve to be critiqued, but it cannot be ignored. And I think that that's it's in some ways a tragedy today that it is being ignored, because I think the themes that it raises about violence and male-male relationships and male-female relationships are too powerful and too important to ignore, in my view, especially in today in the Me Too era. A lot of what this film has to say is, or what this film depicts, is, I think, very, very relevant, and in some ways more relevant even when this film was made. And one thing you have to say for this picture is this movie retains its capacity to shock across decades of time and changes in mores. And yeah, this is the humiliation of them laughing at him and him just steaming inside and holding it all back, not even showing it on his face, Yeah. He wants to kill these guys right from the beginning. This film's power is undiminished, and I know that for a fact, because when I showed this film to a class, the outrage and both the outrage and the praise that greeted this picture following the screening. We obviously discussed it afterwards, and and here he one-ups them. Yeah, he's glad he did that. He may look scared, but he's glad he did it. The discussion afterwards, the reaction to this picture, both hating it and loving it and admiring it and disturbed by it, were exactly the same reactions as occurred when this film came out. I don't know if you can say that about any other movie made in this era. This film is completely undiminished in its power. It is as raw and as impactful and as uncompromising and as powerful as it was the day that it was released. And that in and of itself is a tremendous accomplishment. Yeah, here's another scene here where, yeah. Yeah, I can see why that really, really bugged people. It is going too far. There's no question. But I think this film, without going too far, would be much, much less than it is, for all of its faults and failings and even reprehensible aspects. Here's a very interesting moment. Yeah. Here's the other side of him. He's horrified by it. Horrified at that point. And that's his cowardice coming through. Yeah. And there you see a much... What does that look mean? Peckinpah leaves a lot of this film very, very ambiguous. The dialogue in a lot of... quite often is talking around things. Peter Vaughan here is absolutely marvelous. Veteran British actor. If you grew up watching PBS like I did, having a British mother, if you grew up watching PBS, you certainly knew who Peter Vaughan was. He's wonderful here. Yeah, and she likes him too. Yeah, she is the town. Oh, the town slut in the making. She is a stereotype. There's no doubt. There's no question about that. Silence. Everybody looking at him. I think scenes like this and Peckinpah's own reputation led some people to refer to this picture as a Western, or as like a sort of modern Western. I don't think that's true. I think this is a very, very modern film and deals with modern issues, which again plays back into what I was talking about earlier with the upheaval in the United States that he's come to escape. As an academic, he would have been under a lot of pressure to take a side. And this was also a point at which the United States was becoming a much more violent country than it had been ever since the closing of the Wild West. and he's come here, to get some peace, and the violence follows him because, as Peckinpah believed, violence is a product of human society, and a village is as much a society as anything else. I suppose this guy here, the constable, could be seen as the one noble character in the film, but as I was saying, he meets a very ignoble end, which I'll talk about because it was a very, very interesting moment for me. The moment when he is killed. And then he makes a move here. Buy him another one. Yeah, he's, passive aggressively, he's making his presence known. They're aggressive and he's passive aggressive, but it's aggression. Yeah. 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 Drink too. The alcohol in this picture, even she's got alcohol right there. I mean, Peckinpah, was an alcoholic. Drank himself into, I think in his later career, unfortunately, he drank himself out of the movie business in a lot of ways, just becoming unable to function in a competent manner. And again, this is an interesting scene because here David is the aggressor. And just by turning that music up, he's very clearly asserting himself, if you like. And then he insults the Reverend. Or, at any rate, intimidates him intellectually, And Amy is definitely not too happy about it. But again, this is power relationships. He's trying to assert his dominance over the Reverend. And he's... it has to be an intellectual one because David is not a particularly intimidating person physically. And he's not physically aggressive until finally he gets the opportunity and has no choice. And the cat is going to be very significant in just a little bit. Yeah, he knows he's much smarter than anyone else in the room, and he lets them know it. He's just playing with them. And he tries to come back at him. David's not having it. Yeah. 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 David won this one. He's the alpha male now. Yeah. It meant boys fighting, really, is what this film is about. And I do think, in the end, that as misogynist as this film is a far more brutal critique of men than it is of women. It's a far more brutal attack on masculinity than it is on femininity. And in an age today when we are talking about toxic masculinity all the time, yeah, she's right, he was awful. When we talk about toxic masculinity all the time, I think this film deserves to be looked at in that context. And I think that this film, in terms of what it has to say about toxic masculinity, or what we call toxic masculinity today, is very important. It really is. And it's very honest. It's utterly unsparing. And Peckinpah does not try to let anybody off the hook. Because I think Peckinpah had that in him. Peckinpah was himself very much a kind of toxically masculine guy, if I can, distort the English language that way. He liked guns. He hit, his wives and girlfriends. He was an abusive man. He was also, I'm told, at some points, a very good person and a very gentle person. Obviously, he was a man of artistic disposition, but he was capable of violence against women, violence against men. He was a hunter, he liked guns, and there it is. There's the dead cat. This is the moment when he should stand up. This is the moment when he should fire those guys and say, "You killed my cat, I'm not having this, get the hell out." And I think what Peckinpah's saying here is, if he had stood up now, this never would have happened. And I think Amy feels the same way. And Amy understands the situation perfectly. She knows what's going on because she knows these guys. She grew up with them. She knows that they're just going to go, yeah. She knows that it's only going to get worse from here on out. And he's not there yet. He's not at that point where he can do it. And it's only when he's pushed to his absolute limit that the rage inside him comes out, She's wearing there the same bathrobe that she will wear, I think, after the rape. If I'm not mistaken. She knows exactly what happened. And he's doing everything possible to avoid doing something about it. Because he's afraid. I mean, he is, again, he is a coward. There's no doubt. He's not a physically courageous person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's absolutely right. Because if he believed it, he'd have to act. And that's the last thing he wants to do. Yeah, and then he breaks the clock. That's rage. Yeah. He's mad at them, but he can't do anything about it, so he gets mad at her. And again, she's the only rational person here. She gets what's going on completely. That's not true in most other Peckinpah films. Women, by and large, don't really play into most other Peckinpah pictures. Certainly not his great pictures, except for Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, where I think Isla Vega is her name. The Mexican actress plays a very big role in the first half. But other than that, women, they're not really a factor in most of his great movies. And of course, the girl in Ride the High Country, but she's more of a supporting player. Amy is by far the biggest and the most fully realized female performance in any of his movies. And I think that I have to say, I imagine largely thanks to Susan George. I think she's extremely sympathetic. I don't see the film as degrading her, or I don't think the film portrays her in any way as a negative character who sort of deserves what she gets at all. But I will say I think that's largely due to Susan George. I think Peckinpah did look down on her character, or at least that was what he said. It's interesting though that Peckinpah himself said that he felt the ultimate bad guy in the film is David. David because he felt that David brings this down on himself. David wants it. David wants this kind of confrontation ultimately. And as such, he serves ultimately as the villain. He brings this down on both of them. And if he had, again, if he had done what he was supposed to do, none of it would have happened. And of course, who takes the initiative here? She does. Which is part of her asserting a certain dominance over them, which they are then going to commit a horrific act of violence in order to reassert themselves. And here is Peckinpah showing you the gun that's going to go off in the third act. That is a nasty piece of machinery, and it is, yeah. He's letting you know just how powerful it is. Yeah, and that is going to be used in a very nasty way. I love how they keep calling him Sir, even though they have absolutely no respect for him whatsoever. Excuse me. None whatsoever. He's just a nerd to them. Which, again, is another reason why Hoffman works, because he is an extremely nerdy-looking guy, you know. And yet, at the end, he what he does is so skilled at the end, and what him and Peckinpah managed to create at the end, you believe him as a man who's capable of that kind of violence. And that's a difficult thing for an actor to do and for a director to get, is that that kind of, to make that believable, to make that 180-degree shift believable. And I must say, Hoffman pulls it off brilliantly. And he never played a character this dynamic or this complex again, I don't think. Jerry Fielding's score to this film is magnificent. It's beautifully dissonant and quiet for the most part. And he's using it here with great, because of course they've already come up with their plan. She knows she knows it's not a good idea. Yeah, he thinks this is again him. He thinks now he's becoming part of the camaraderie. He's being accepted by these guys, and he wants that. He's willing to take that chance. He's even going after her in order to do it. You know, he wants to be one of the guys. He wants the alpha males to accept him so that he can be one of them. You know, and they're using that obviously. They have no intention whatsoever of letting him into the group. That's such a great. It's one of the things Peckinpah was so good at, is to have those little touches when she breaks the spaghetti, showing her anger and frustration. You know, yeah, and she knows they're laughing at him to show her anger and frustration. Peckinpah had a wonderful eye for detail. You know, he doesn't get a lot of credit for that. He's seen consistently as over the top. I don't think that's fair. I think he had a wonderful eye for the smaller things. You know, I do think this is Peckinpah's greatest picture. Um, because I think it's a culmination of, yeah. I have to say the tension that builds in this film is so overwhelming. Um, because if you look at the progression of pictures that he was making, where he was trying to make a statement about violence, about male violence, about the way that men relate to each other and relate to women, and trying to do that in a very unvarnished, um, kind of brutally honest, transgressive way. This is the ultimate example of that. He never got it as purely and as totally as he did in this picture. And this is the film I feel like where Peckinpah, for better or for worse, really says his piece. Um, and I admire it more than any of his other films. There are films he made that I like better. I have very very strong feelings about Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which I absolutely love, and I'd say that's my favorite Peckinpah movie. But I do think this is a greater picture. I think it's harder to watch. It's not a film you watch for fun, you know. But I think it's in when you do sit through it, if you can make it, you know, as it gets steadily more and more horrific. If you can make it all the way through, it's a more rewarding film in terms of what it has to say. You know, Packard and Billy the Kid's a much more elegiac picture, and so is the Wild Bunch. There's nothing elegiac about Straw Dogs. It's utterly in your face and ferocious. I just wanted to, before I forget, the scene just before this where he tells him to break the shotgun. That's how you know that Peckinpah was a guy who grew up around guns. Only someone who grew up around guns would know that. You always treat a gun as if it's loaded. Doesn't matter if it's loaded or unloaded. You always treat it like it's loaded. So break it. Now you're sure. That I'm sure that was something that, maybe the first time they took him out hunting, he didn't break his gun, when he was a little kid, and they were like, break it, now you're sure. I'm sure he took that from life, That's something you learn at a very early age if you grow up around firearms. And only someone who had would know that. And of course, they've taken him on a snipe hunt. And here's where things get really, really ugly. What's about to transpire here is, like I said, maybe one of the most controversial scenes in cinema history. It caused outrage at the time. It causes outrage now. Again, when I showed it must have been about 10 years ago, to a class, it caused outrage. It will always cause outrage. Whether that's to he can't even fire the gun. Whether that's to Peckinpah's credit or not is not really for me to decide. I think that's very much up to the viewer. And I will say that it's a deeply, obviously disturbing, but also ambivalent scene. And there are people out there who think you should never be ambiguous. And there are people who say, yeah, and now here we go into it. There are people who say you should never be ambiguous about something like rape, which is, I think, a totally defensible position. I think that Peckinpah is being ambiguous here, partly to be transgressive, partly to be misogynist, it has to be said, partly to be misandrist, and also I think, and I really hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but I can tell you that one of the things that, at least from what I've read, one of the things that prosecutors of rape cases often say is that they're very often difficult to prosecute because people are looking for a totally unambiguous situation. They're looking for the young virgin, white, the young white blonde-haired virgin girl who's walking home from church at night and gets, grabbed by some guy who rapes her, and that to their mind is what juries and judges are always looking for. They don't want to deal with, let's say, a girl who brings a guy up to her room and, they kiss or whatever, and she just, but she doesn't want to go any further than that, and then he forces her to go further than that. That's one of those cases where a lot of times juries will, this is one of the things that got people, is that at first she fights back, and it's very clearly a rape, and then later she appears to be consenting, which yes, is reprehensible. But as I was saying, it's also, I think, this is when when I showed it, this is when people really started to get very, very uncomfortable, when he starts beating her. But so they're looking for something that's not ambiguous at all, and a lot of times date rape and things like that have a certain ambiguity to them. So in a way, I think what Peckinpah's saying is, here's an ambiguous situation, and he's challenging you to say this is wrong, anyway. And Peckinpah's saying, do you really believe that? What do you really think? You know? And I think that's what horrifies people, because a lot of people don't want to admit what they really, because a lot of people may feel she is asking for this, even though they would never say that, you know? And so Peckinpah's, yeah. See, here I do think it's totally from her point of view. When you see these distorted point of view shots and stuff, you know? Um, yeah, like these shots. This is definitely from her point of view, you know? I think her point of view, and I think the way that Susan George plays it does get across the sort of horrifying nature of what's happening here. Again, maybe against Peckinpah's will, you know? But this was something that Peckinpah said came out of his own anxieties, you know? What if someone rapes your woman? What do, you know, as a man? How do you react to that? How should you think about it? Do you think it's some way her fault? Do you think she may have encouraged it even? These are things that men think about. We don't like to think that we think them, but we do, you know? Whether that's justifiable, unjustifiable, moral, immoral. I mean, you know, we think immoral things. We think unjustifiable things. It's human nature. It's who we are, and it's part of masculinity in a lot of cases. So I think that Peckinpah is confronting all of that here, and in his transgression, he is attempting to confront us with those things within ourselves. You know, and I think particularly inside men. Because I think that Peckinpah is ultimately making this picture for men, which again you can say is good or bad. Yeah, and the flash cut to David, he's not so different, you know. Yeah, a lot of people interpreted this as her basically saying yes, you know. Um, the fact that she in the end gives up and even expresses some affection for him. People saw that as being like she's really consenting. She really wants it, you know. She just has to be forced into it, you know, which is a absolutely valid interpretation. And I think that that's, you know, I think that that's a totally legitimate criticism of this scene. On the other hand, there's shots like that, which to me are speaking of something much different. Yeah, here. It's the ambiguousness of it. It's the ambiguousness of it that gives it its power. Whether that's evil or not, yeah, when she says that. On the other hand, is she collaborating just so she doesn't get hurt any further? You know, that's another question. It's the ambiguity of the film the scene that gives it its power. And I think Peckinpah's saying, you know, like, you know, how do you feel about this deep down? And I think that may be the most disturbing thing. I think that may be the most horrifying thing, especially for men watching this scene. You know, um, and yeah, see, he's just going right off the cliff. You know, he just wants to go all the way with it. And now David kills for the first time, but not for the last. But, and I think at this point, audiences originally, when this first came out, may have breathed a sigh of relief that that scene was finally over. And now Peckinpah is about to pull a extremely nasty trick on them. Yeah, he still feels ashamed. He still isn't prepared for to kill yet. But maybe in a kind of ironic way, they've broken him in. They've given him his first taste of blood, and in a strange way, this is going to enable him in the end to kill them all, basically. This is where things get, if they haven't been horrifying already, it's so great the way Peckinpah does this. On the eyes, and then, the gun barrel. When I showed this, one of the women in the class just went, "Oh no." She knew what was coming. Yeah. And what does he do? He collaborates with his friend. Because ultimately the men stand with each other. You call that rape culture, you can call that toxic masculinity. Doesn't really matter what you call it, but it's real. And it's brutally honest what's being depicted in this moment. He's gonna assist. This parts of the scene were cut in a censored version. Yeah. This is absolutely horrifying. Yep. But this is all about... Because ultimately what this is about is humiliating her. Crushing her spirit, essentially, and asserting their dominance. Let's give you an idea of what an asshole Peckinpah could be at times. He apparently, psychologically abused Susan George by giving her very explicit descriptions of what the rape scene was going to be like. And at one point, she simply stood up and said, you can find yourself another actress, and walked out. And in the end, convinced him to play it out almost entirely on her face. Again, showing how much she helped to shape this performance. And I think that is, one of the things that redeems this film, if you like, from just becoming a kind of misogynist screed. One of the things that certainly redeems it is Susan George's performance during that scene, where you really do sense the horror and ambiguity of it. There's no hint, of course, that David even grasped that something is going on here, which I think really, I regret to say, is not necessarily inaccurate. Women often don't tell their boyfriends or husbands or whatever that they've been raped. So a lot of times they keep it a secret, or they only tell one or two people, and very often not their significant other. Of course, what does he do? He yells at her. And she just says it to him right here. You're a coward. And why is he firing them? Because of what they've done to him. It even does show she's got a mark there on her cheek, which I think is intentional, from the slapping. And he doesn't even notice. Yep. She's absolutely right. Childish stunt. Just terrible. Yep. This is really horrible. What's happening here? I mean, obviously, he doesn't know, so you can't sort of necessarily hate him for it. But what's going on here, intentionally or unintentionally, is just, horrendous. Yeah. He knows he is. the society, the village in a way, has swallowed her back in by violating her. You know, the men have all taken a piece of her. To use a vulgar way of putting it, you know. Again, this here, I mean, I do think that Susan George, yeah, she plays the trauma, the flashbacks, stuff like that, the absolutely brilliantly. And here, much too late, you know, finally stands up to it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, looking out towards the village, where all the bad stuff comes from. I love this little scene between the two of them, you know, where she just says, you know, we have to go out. And obligations have to be met, in spite of everything that's happened. Wordless almost. Beautifully done. Mm. You still do get the feeling, though, that it's not irreparably broken. You feel like they could still make it, you know, in spite of everything. But, and it's only that last cataclysmic end to this story that ultimately tears them apart. This is, for all that I've been accepting or criticizing Peckinpah here for his depiction of women and depiction of rape and all that, this sequence here is absolutely, I think, a sympathetic, honest, and I would imagine rather accurate view of rape trauma. Um, there is nothing here to indicate that Amy has enjoyed what's happened to her in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, see, and the way that Peckinpah brilliantly intercuts her flashbacks with what's going on, with increasing chaos on the part from the screaming kids, and then the vicar giving, the reverend giving his little party piece and all the rest of it. You know, I think that he really does conjure up for you exactly what's going on, and yeah, see, that's exactly what's going on in her head, you know, and he does conjure that up for you in a very sympathetic way. I don't think this scene can be accused of being an apologetic for rape or a misogynistic scene at all, you know. And there are many, many cases of women who are raped by an acquaintance or by a friend or a friend of a friend, and then they have to see that person again, you know, sometimes on a regular basis. So I think this is quite accurate. This is also the beginning of the climax to this film. And I think that from here on out, this film is an unmitigated tour de force. I think that this is Peckinpah at his absolute best, and I'm not sure he ever topped this whole last quarter, if you like, of this picture. The momentum that's built up over the course of the last quarter of this movie is truly, truly extraordinary. And the way too that he cuts it, and the way that his camera angles begin to change. here he's, for example, showing the Reverend straight on, and then as things grow more tense and more, the cuts get faster, and there you go, you get these low angle shots all of a sudden, with a just slightly distorted lens. Things start to become more and more surreal. Things start to appear to become slightly out of control. I think he got a lot of this from Don Siegel, who was a mentor of his, and for instance, in films like The Shootist and Dirty Harry, you see Siegel using this technique to sort of begin to disorient the viewer, as tensions begin to reach a climax. Yeah, I agree, that's going a bit far. But this whole movie's about going too far, so what can you say, really? Yeah, this is bad, I have to admit. Yep. Now the cuts are getting shorter. Peckinpah was a master of editing. I mean, as far as montage is concerned, to use the pretentious term, there aren't many who are better than him. He has a billion imitators today, many of whom have probably never even seen one of his movies. They're just copying, a copy of a copy of a copy of people who have aped his style. But if you when you see the original, the power of it is truly, truly remarkable, I must say. Yeah, this is a really. I suppose it's necessary for the plot, but it's really the idea that a young girl would go off with a local child molester for a bit of fun is a bit of a fantasy, to say the least. A bit of a misogynist fantasy. Peckinpah was actually in a pretty bad spot when he made this movie. There had been huge problems on the Ballad of Cable Hogue with his behavior, and he essentially had to go to England, and in order to get a job, he'd been blackballed essentially out of Hollywood, and not for the first time. Yeah, see, she can't take it anymore. And he went to England, and he hooked up with this producer, I think David Melnick or Daniel Melnick, I can't remember exactly right now. And he said, you should know that I'm totally unemployable. And Melnick said to him, "That's exactly why I want to work with you." And the first film they made together was this one, which was quite a, they really went for it. And the way that Peckinpah uses music here in terms of that diegetic music, and then intercutting it with this singer. And there are all these threads that have built up over the course of this film. I had a professor once who said, this film is like a symphony. There's all these little threads, all these little themes that have been working themselves out over the course of this movie with Niles and with these men and their relationship with each other, their relationship with David, their sexual aggression towards Amy, Amy's relationship with David. And all of these themes are now coming together into one climax. They're all binding together into one sort of, you know, crescendo, and it's beautifully done. I mean, he's cutting back and forth between different locations here, different scenes, and it's just flawless. It's remarkable how he kept it all in his head. I have no idea. Yeah, see, that's bad. That's really bad. But it's of a keeping. I mean, it's where Peckinpah's been going through this whole film. Take things way out as far as you can and see what happens. I think he definitely took this from Of Mice and Men. Yeah, no, a Sermon of the Dead. As are extinguished, yeah. Quite a bit is about to be extinguished now. Mm. Sin. Peckinpah believed in fallen man. There's no question in my mind. He absolutely believed that. I think he absolutely believed in original sin. Yeah, man is corrupted. I love how he doesn't actually show her dying. It's just, yeah, and then all of a sudden, he just shows the legs hanging there, and then, the staring eyes. He doesn't actually give you the moment when it happens. The drink, alcohol. I mean, alcohol plays a role in so much violence, male violence especially. I mean, I've certainly known times where I've walked into a bar and I could feel that a fight was going to break out. He just knew it, and then it did. I think it's just that alcohol lowers the inhibitions, and all that's repressed, you know, explodes basically. It all comes out. Doesn't need much of an excuse. Yep. She's quite right, of course. Who would want him there? And David is playing self-righteous here. He's tired of people telling him what to do, basically. Yeah. So beautifully composed, that shot. Peter Vaughn in the foreground and then the two behind him. Yeah, bottle and another. That's the booze. None of this would have happened without alcohol. And they, I think, feel totally justified in what they're doing here. And they think, they've cowed him anyway. You know, they've intimidated him. They've raped his wife. They don't have anything to worry about from him. Yeah. Alcohol and guns. The American. Yeah. He's the foreigner. Yeah, he's playing the noble American here. You know, this is a little bit from a Western, I think. It's a very, very standard Western scenarios. The mob comes for the man who may be guilty, but you know, the righteous lawman stands up and says, no, this man deserves a fair trial and you can't just hang him, you know. Mm, yeah. None of your business. You don't belong here. Again, society. Human society causes violence. That was Peckinpah's belief. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's starting. This is the beginning of what he sees as her betrayal, which was something else that I think people really objected to. Feminists objected to in the portrayal of Amy's character, that she appears to betray him. Well, she does try to betray him at a certain point in this final sequence. Um, Again, I think it's got to be seen in the fact that Peckinpah's just pointing to the ambiguities of the realities of a situation like this. She wants to live, and I mean David's for some reason defending the local child molester, and you know she's trying to take her only way out, and that's I think it's something that anyone would certainly, at the very least, contemplate doing. Look, fella. Yes, this is my house. This is what it comes down to. My territory, my wife, my woman. You know, he's entering this discourse of violence that he's been both playing with and trying to avoid through the whole thing. But something's happening. He's beginning to reach the end of his tether. Mm. I know how they feel. He does know how they feel in a sense. I mean, you know, he's as violent as they are. I can handle this. I mean, he's David is sensing something that's absolutely true, which is that this is between the men. This really doesn't have anything to do with her. This is now all about power. And he's not quite there yet. He's still scared. He's still intimidated. Such false bravado there. Now, there's a scene coming up here that to me epitomizes the power of this picture. I'll talk about it when I get to it, but it's the little touches here, like that idiot, playing with the tricycles. Yeah. Mm. They all have blood. That's what he means it. Yeah. Again, she's being quite sensible. He covers up by self-righteousness. You really don't care. Yeah, he tries to play noble here. But this line coming up. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I will not allow violence against this house. And of course, I read somewhere someone pointed out that it's not his house, actually. It's her house. It was her father's house. But he's marked his territory now. He's established it as his. He's the man. He's in control. Great series of cuts there. And here is the totally ineffective constable. Yeah, the rat guy. And he thinks he can just go out and yell at them and everything will be fine. Which I don't think anyone actually plans for what happens here. Things go too far, as they often do. When people are drunk, people have guns, people are angry. Men, basically. Things like this occur all the time. Now, this scene, I remember distinctly when I showed this to a class, that at the moment when that shotgun goes off, literally the entire class just sat back in their seats, as if they were blown back by the power of it. There, right there. That sound just knocked them back. And that's when it really hit me just how powerful this film really is and how totally undiminished its power is. Now, it's out of control. Carnage. Yeah, I think particularly from here on out, this is absolutely extraordinary. Mm. 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 There is a certain kind of Rambo quality to what happens from here on out that is a little bit Hollywood. Um, the way that this guy manages to take out, five guys. Um, but I think it's done with enough. It's innovative enough. Peckinpah comes up with enough good tricks that it's plausible. You believe that it could actually happen. Um, there was always that line with Peckinpah where he was a set piece director. He liked to have his little tricks and stuff. And at certain points you may feel that realism is sacrificed for the sake of that. I mean, is there anything really realistic about the end of the Wild Bunch? I mean, the idea that these, you know, handful of guys could hold off an army for that long is pretty implausible. But it's done with such vitality and such inventiveness that you just go with it. He had that way of captivating you, and I think also the power of the editing. Um, the way that he is so sort of adept at creating this jagged pacing, that kind of picks you up and drags you along, and you don't even really have time to think about whether this is plausible or not. Because you're so taken in by by the montage, if you like, the movement that's created by that. He was much more of an editing director than a lot of the other directors of his era. A lot of, and even today, I mean, today directors love long takes and sort of wide static shots and things like that. Orson Welles once said, that's how we separated the men from the boys, was how long you could hold a wide shot. Peckinpah doesn't go in for that at all. He doesn't particularly like wide angle lenses, for one thing, but he also cuts very, very aggressively and very quickly, quite often. And this was in an era when people didn't cut this quickly at all. Um, and that really kind of stands out from his other from his contemporaries for that. Yeah, this is the part where a lot of people objected to this scene. But I think this is the moment when Hoffman breaks. This is the moment when you know, when he gives in finally. When he finally gives into it. That look on his face. He's just become something else. Yeah. his face is really almost totally distorted through a lot of this final sequence. And a testimony, yeah. And he grabs her hair just the way Venner grabbed her hair when he raped her. I don't think he's become like them. I think he always was them. I'll break your neck. That's it. That's the line. He means it too. You believe him in that moment. You haven't quite believed him up to now, but you believe him when he says that. Peckinpah had a great sense of the sound of gunfire. Again, growing up with guns, he knew how loud it was and how shocking it was. And he was one of the first filmmakers to really bring that across. And, you know, I think it's one of the reasons the violence in his movies has such impact. We're dead if they get in. He's right. They're both right in a way. She's just doesn't realize now the gravity of what's happened, and that they're, you know, David is now right about their intentions. This is what he's wanted to do all along. Now he can. Maybe morally he feels he can, but also I think her betraying him breaks his last tie to sanity, you know. Yep. Yeah. You absolutely believe him here. I mean, Hoffman sells it so well. And he proves to be a coward too when he's finally up against it. When someone finally has physical power over him. He's as much of a coward as David ever was. It's not my fault, you know. Ah, the trap. Yeah, and what he does here too, his face when he does this. Yep. This is a sort of classic movie moment here, but it is great when he oh no, it's not here. It's this is where Peckinpah starts to really bring in the slow motion, for which he's famous. He was really the guy who invented the use of slow motion in action sequences. He got it originally from Kurosawa's Seven Samurai. Kurosawa used the slow motion in that film, but he doesn't actually use it for action. He uses it to punctuate the end of the action. He uses it actually when two villains are killed. They fall in slow motion. But the actual violence itself only takes a couple of seconds. It's very fast, which is something that Sergio Leone later picked up on. and copied. But Peckinpah used it for the action itself, which was at that time very, very new and revolutionary for people, and also extremely controversial. Yeah, how loud those shots are there. Um, but he really created a style that is now ubiquitous, so ubiquitous that he's almost been forgotten as the originator of it, which is really a shame, you know. And I think one of the reasons is that his films are, by today's standards, so politically incorrect and so unfashionable in terms of what they have to say and what they deal with. That you know, with I mean, he would have been canceled with cancel culture today. He would never have had a career. He'd have been canceled as soon as Ride the High Country came out. But but I mean, I think today people just prefer to ignore it. They don't really want to deal with it, which is a shame. Here's yeah, his great use of music. This little Scottish tune comes on, the bagpipes. Yeah, he's ready for them now. You really sense it. Yeah, this is what I was talking about. This is such a movie moment, but it's so brilliantly done. It's so great. He knocks this down, and yep. Ah, that is really nasty. Classic Peckinpah, you know. It is a gimmick, you know what I mean? But it's great. It really does work. And he deals with them pretty summarily. This here, I think, is Hoffman's moment here. Just the way he moves his body and the way he uses his face is so terrifying and disturbing. He was actually smashing into a melon here when he appears to be bashing this guy's head in. Yeah, he just looks crushed, you know. And then you can hear in the background the sound of the record player, you know, on the dead air there. This is the one moment when Venner betrays the masculine brotherhood. Bros before hoes, as they would say. Well, here he chooses the woman. here Jerry Fielding's music is just extraordinary. And no sound except for her screaming and the music all on its own. Fielding also is another guy who doesn't get enough credit. He worked mainly with Peckinpah, but he also did a great score for The Outlaw Josie Wales, which Clint Eastwood directed. He's not very well known today as among film composers, but his scores for Peckinpah are fantastic. The score for The Wild Bunch is marvelous. You know, the score for yeah, and here yeah. Yeah, we should have seen that one coming from Act 1. He really drags this out. I think there's a sense here of, again, betrayal, that she's more concerned about Venner's death than about her husband. Or at least he feels that. And there's almost like a look of reproach there. But it's very subtle. I think you can interpret it in several different ways, which is probably what Peckinpah was after. I don't think Peckinpah was interested per se in presenting a single view in this picture. He was more asking questions, I think, than giving answers. But he certainly does ultimately, I think it does ultimately have it definitely says something concrete, ultimately. Yeah. Jesus, I got them all. That's his reaction, and he smiles. And he's smiling throughout most of the rest of the end of this film, and yeah, that's also very movie. You know, the guy you forgot about comes in for a last scare, but it works. You know, it works great. And now she finally really has to choose, and she does choose him. But I think she takes so long that he doesn't really appreciate it. But the thing is that, and people also went after Amy's character here, that she seems so powerless and weak. But I mean, she's the only one who's really reacting in a kind of sane way to all this carnage. She's just totally traumatized. David's smiling. He's like, geez, I got them all. Fantastic. You know, it's a psychotic reaction on his part, really. She's the only one who's still sane out of all of these, out of all of these lunatics, you know? And this is really the impact of this moment here. Ew. But she's near catatonic at this point. And it's pretty much what, if you're a sane human being, you would be after all this. And I do think that this film was attacked as a kind of quasi-fascistic celebration of violence. I don't think it's that at all. I think that this ending is uncompromisingly bleak. I think that there's a great sense of the pointlessness of this, and of the fact that David is round the bend, really, here. You know, whatever he was beforehand is gone. It's destroyed. He may be a stronger person as a result of what's happened, but it's not all certain he's a better person. In fact, I think it's pretty certain he's not. I mean, he basically abandons his wife, who's totally traumatized, and gives a ride home to the child molester, mainly because I think his world is gone. It's been destroyed by this moment. He's not the same person anymore, and he knows it. But he's so sort of round the bend that he's also kind of happy about it. I think maybe he's glad to leave the coward behind, even though he had to kill 5 guys to do it. And of course, what David does is, I mean, if you think about it, legally speaking, totally justifiable. I mean, he was defending himself, and that's very clear, you know. But whether it's a good thing whether what it's done to him is in the end a good thing. I think Peckinpah leaves that very, very much. No, I think Peckinpah's pretty clear that it's not a good thing, you know. And of course, he just drives off into nowhere with that extraordinary final line. You okay? That's all he says. Of course she's not okay. Look at her. And there's that record player still. The static's still going. Great touch there. Peckinpah doesn't get a lot of credit for a sound, the use of sound in his films, and he really should. It's brilliantly done in a lot of his films. And that's the last we'll see of her, just broken by what's happened. I mean, women in Peckinpah's films are often the only sensible people, and they look at the carnage that men do and are just sort of traumatized and also uncomprehending of it. And there's David just smiling away. And here's the famous line. Yeah. There's nowhere to go now, really. He's just going off into darkness and driving off into nowhere, basically. It is a uncompromisingly bleak ending. I don't think Peckinpah was pro-violence by any stretch of the imagination. Supposedly later in life he was disturbed by the fact that people had come to enjoy the violence in his films. And in some sense that's his fault. I mean, he did make it exciting and powerful, in a way that does attract people, But I think in this film particularly, you don't... he doesn't leave you with much at the end. There's no real redemption at the end at all. It's unremittingly bleak. So, well, I thank you for sitting with me through this. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you indulging my self-indulgence, and I'll see you on the next one. Thanks very much. Bye.